So again, welcome on behalf of John Carroll University and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to this third presentation in the 2013 Tuohy Lecture Series, sponsored by the Walter and Mary Tuohy Endowment for Interreligious Studies, on the topic of Jerusalem, Jesus, and Jihad, End Times Scenarios for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Barr, whom we're honored to have as our 2013 Tuohy Fellow. As a well-respected author, scholar, and teacher, Dr. Barr is Emeritus Professor of Religion in the Departments of Religion and Philosophy and Classics at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Barr earned his baccalaureate degree in 1965 from Fort Wayne Bible College and his Master of Arts and PhD from Florida State University in 1969 and 1974, respectively. Professor Barr has been teaching at the university level since that time. His areas of interest include Christian origins, New Testament, apocalypticism, and the Apocalypse of John. With 8 books and several articles to his credit, Professor Barr is well recognized by his peers as an expert on apocalyptic literature, including the New Testament exemplar of that genre, the Book of Revelation, or Apocalypse of John. Apocalyptic literature addresses the questions of ultimate meaning and the goal of all of God's creation, and what are the roles of human communities in reaching those ultimate ends. As those of you know who have attended his earlier lectures, Dr. Barr is using this lecture series to bring into conversation with each other Jewish, Christian, and Muslim views of the eschaton, or final things, raising the question of the significance of these similar yet different views for contemporary American culture. His remarks the first week outlined Jewish, Christian, and Muslim views of the end times, which involve the appearance of the ultimate savior and anti-savior, and a final battle between those allied with each side. Last week, Professor Barr gave us insight into Jewish literature of the Hellenistic period, which begins to present the image of a world in which God is not entirely in control and evil is allowed to flourish. In his lecture this evening, Dr. Barr directs our attention to the images of Satan and an anti-savior figure, or Antichrist, in his lecture entitled, Did God Fail? A Role for Satan. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor David Barr.
65, he must be an old fart by now. I don't know what you imagine when you think of Satan. Perhaps you've seen the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Or maybe you're more attracted to something like William Blake. But if I had to guess, if you're a typical American, your notion of Satan owes more to John Milton and his poem Paradise Lost than it does to anything in the Bible or the Quran. Milton did what the Bible never did. He created a unified picture of the origin and character of Satan, a rather more heroic character than he probably intended, whose motto was better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Sounding a little bit like Mark Twain, I think. Now, according to the polls I've seen, about 78% of the American people believe in the existence of Satan, a number that surprises me just a little. Then I tend to be surprised by people's credulity. I suspect Satan remains popular for much of the same reason that he was invented, or discovered if you prefer. He's a very handy person to have around. A recent television series portrayed Satan under this guise, sort of a dark, hooded figure, which some people thought reminded them of another character they knew, which may coordinate some with the fact that a Gallup poll showed that about 24% of Republicans thought that Obama could be, not that he was, could be the Antichrist. The reason for that will become more clear, I hope, by the end of the lecture this evening. Now, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all give a prominent place for a being called Satan, or Shaitan, or Iblis, and to his evil twin of the end times, the Antichrist, known as Amalus in Judaism or the Dajjal in Islam. If you need to spell such things, they go something like that. Now, the Antichrist is a human figure of the end times. Satan is a spiritual figure understood somewhat differently by each of the three traditions. And so briefly, the differences between the three traditions and their understanding of Satan. Classically, Jews have conceived of Satan as a demon, one among many. We're just not quite in the right place here. See if that works better. He's not the leader of demons, he's just one of the demons, and he's not a fallen angel, he is a demon. Many Jews today understand Satan symbolically to refer either sociologically to, am I close enough? I'm seeing some frowns. Feel free to interrupt at any time. Understood either as a social force of the forces that lead us astray sociologically, or more likely as a psychological force. Within each of us there is, Jews think, an inclination to good and an inclination to evil. And one of the ways of talking about the inclination to evil is to name it Satan. Some Hasidic Jews, influenced by a mystical medieval work called the Kabbalah, have a rather interesting understanding that God uses Satan to tempt us, and when he succeeds, he accuses us to God. He works for God, that is, and is completely submissive to God. So I think my summary of Jewish belief in Satan is, well, sort of they believe in Satan. It's not quite like you find in Christianity or Islam. Classically, Christians refer to Satan or the devil or Lucifer, different names for the same person, sort of also known as, whom they take to be a fallen angel in rebellion against God for some reason, trying to deceive and corrupt humanity. Christians have a rather well-developed mythology of a primitive angel who, say for some reason, decides to rebel against God and leads other angels in rebellion, is eventually kicked out of heaven and sets up shop on earth where he succeeds beyond his wildest expectations. Paul, in one of his letters, called him the God of this world. He is, in Christian view, the head of an army of demons, and he is determined to overthrow the rule of God. Now, interestingly enough, functional belief in Satan seems to be more prominent among Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants than other kinds of Christians. Both of those still have rites of exorcism, that is a ritual process by which a demon is expelled from some person. Most Christian denominations no longer do such things. Islam is much like Christianity in this regard, with a few differences. Muslims refer to the devil as Iblis. It's probably a variation of the Greek word diabolos, which means the devil. Translated into Arabic, it somehow, I think, came out Iblis. Has almost all the consonants and most of the vowels. He is not, however, an angel in Islamic thought. He is a jinn, because angels have no moral agency. That is, in Muslim creation mythology, God created 4 classes of beings: angels, jinn, demons, and humans. The last 3 have moral agency, that is, the ability to choose between good and evil. Angels have no such ability. They are simply God's servants and can only choose the good. So Satan is not an angel, but this class of jinn. And I think I have a chart. I couldn't find a poll that said how many Muslims believe in Satan. But I take this number of the number that believe in jinn as probably an equivalent number, and you can see it varies by region, but is fairly high for most Muslims. In the story in the Quran, the story goes that when God created Adam in his own image, he required the angels and jinn to bow before him. But Iblis refused, saying he was the older and better creation. And because of his refusal, God expels him from his service. But in an interesting twist, he asked that he might be permitted a reprieve until the day of resurrection in order to exercise his way with humans. And for reasons that remain mysterious, God grants that reprieve. And so since that time, Iblis has been determined to get Adam to bow down before him rather than the other way around. The story derives from an older Jewish work called The Life of Adam and Eve, and with this innovative exception of being free to corrupt humanity as God grants it. One striking difference between the Muslim portrayal of Iblis and the Christian portrayal of Satan is that Iblis has no power over humanity. He cannot harm humanity in any way. His power is only that of seduction and temptation. Classically seen in the temptation story of Adam and Eve, in the Muslim view of that, that is Satan tempting them. He can seduce, but he cannot command. Whereas in the Christian view of Satan, he's a much more active and powerful figure. Now, within this diversity between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Satan plays a similar role in all three traditions. He's a major actor in the drama of the end times. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that without Satan, the drama of the end times would be substantially different and would lack one of its crucial elements, the issue of holy war, which we'll turn our attention to next week. Satan appears in each of the end time stories, both in his own form and in a human form, which we'll consider in a few moments. Now, last week we considered the development of the notion of the end times as a major shift in worldview, substantially reversing what I call the two-path paradigm, that is, do good and prosper, do evil and face punishment. In the end time paradigm, anyone who does good will suffer, and only the evil will prosper, because the times have changed. We looked at this historically first, especially in the situation of Antiochus IV, who tried to force Jews to abandon their ancestral ways and adopt Greek religion. And then we looked at two literary texts that address the historical situation, the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Daniel, neither of which mentions the devil or Satan, but both of them relate the human catastrophe to the activity of spiritual beings. So sort of a precursor of the Satan idea occurs in these early texts. The Book of the Watchers portray angels abandoning their post because of their sexual desire for human wives, and then teaching humans the arts of war, seduction, and astrology. Turn page. In the story of the Watchers, this so pollutes the world that God has no choice but to destroy it, and so the flood is the inevitable result. The implicit warning is clear: avoid such temptations or face dire consequences. Daniel, on the other hand, sees the battle has already begun, but the battle between the Judeans and Antiochus is just a manifestation of a greater battle between the prince of Persia and the prince of God's people, Michael, thus a final battle. Now, once the notion of the end times had been invented, details would evolve over the next several centuries, including considerable development in the idea of Satan. For example, in the Christian end time story, known as the Book of Revelation, Satan is a fully developed character. He's expelled from heaven. He is forced to come to earth, where he wreaks havoc. He tries to kill the Messiah, but fails. Failing that, he turns to make war on anyone who follows the Messiah. He is in charge of government, in charge of commerce, in charge of religion. He enforces the worship of Satan, and anyone refusing to do so will meet with dire consequences. So he's a powerful, demanding figure, punishing all those who refuse to worship him. Now, this is a significant job upgrade from where we find him in the apocryphal works I've been talking about so far. And so I'd kind of like to take a peek at his resume and see how he got this new job. I have to tell you up front, there's some irregularities in his CV, including his actual name. So, the history of Satan. For starters, we cannot trace his career very far back. He just seems to appear. Always a suspicious fact. We're so accustomed to a figure like Satan that we don't notice his absence from all the Old Testament. The prophets, for example, never blame Israel's ills on Satan. They always blame them on Israel. It has no role in prophetic literature. In fact, almost the opposite in their way of thinking. But that's to get ahead of our story a little bit. The fact is, Satan is not a native to Israel. He's an immigrant. The short story, just in case you doze off later, I like to give the short story first. He hitched a ride from his native Persia with Jews returning from the exile. I picture him as sort of riding back in one of the wagons on the back. Nobody noticed him. Just another one of the returnees. The Jews had for decades lived under Persian rule as part of their exile, and I think they picked up this character not knowing quite what they had. But it's not quite that simple, I think. It is, however, my best guess. So, something of the longer story. First, there's not a single mention of the devil anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. And if you look for the word Satan, it occurs only 3 times. And those 3 times are in these verses here. Very brief references. You probably know at least one of the stories. There are in the Hebrew Scriptures an impressive list of demons mentioned. We've gone over some of their names and we'll see more of them later. Interestingly, Satan never appears on the list of demons. And I think that's because he has another job. Namely, he's the public prosecutor in God's court. The clearest portrayal of Satan's role is in the book of Job. And this, I think, probably everybody knows the story of the book of Job. Job was a righteous man, and God was really proud of him. And one day, God's agents, they're called sons of God in the story, come to report to God what they found on the earth, and Satan is one of them. And so God asks him, he hears the reports, yeah. And have you considered my servant Job, how righteous he is? And Satan says, you think he's righteous? He just does good because you look after him. And God says, you think so? Well, let's test him and see. And so they proceed with the Job story to test Job's attributes. Now, Satan in this story is not a name, it is a title. In Hebrew it's Ha-Satan, the Satan, and the word Satan means accuser. So he is called the accuser, not Satan in anything like its modern sense. He is, in other words, the one who comes around like Santa Claus at Christmas time to find out who's been naughty and who's been nice and report that to God, who might want to know such things. His role is God's prosecuting attorney, so to speak, and that's all the more evident in the second story. And this is a story you probably don't know. Joshua the high priest is being put on trial, and Satan is standing there ready to bring the accusations when God says, no accusations, I'm going to let him go. I'm going to forgive his guilt and restore him to his place. So it's pretty clear in this story that Satan is a role that some heavenly being plays, the accuser, and that he works entirely at God's discretion. God can hear the accusation, or he can refuse to hear the accusation. The third reference is a little more ambiguous and much more interesting. It's found in 1 Chronicles 21, where again the story is probably unfamiliar to you, but it begins, Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. This displeases God. Apparently, David is supposed to trust in God and not count his soldiers. And so God sends a plague on Israel and kills many of them. Now, Satan is portrayed as something more than an accuser here. I'd call him an inciter, or what we would call today, I think, entrapment. Even more strange, we have a second version of the story written before the exile, or perhaps during it. And in that version of the story, Satan is missing altogether. In the version found in 2 Samuel 24, it is Yahweh who incites David to take the sentence, and who then gets mad at him because he does so. A bit strange, to be sure. The idea of God inciting disobedience seems strange to us. It is quite in keeping, however, with a pre-exilic view of Yahweh as an absolute God. Other instances. In the Exodus story, God is both the one who gets Moses to convince Pharaoh to let God's people go from their slavery, and the one who hardens Pharaoh's heart to prevent him from doing so, sort of working at cross purposes with himself. In the story of Moses being called back to Egypt, God first convinces him to go, and then while he's on the road there, God intercepts him and attempts to kill him before he can get back. Again, working somewhat at cross purposes with himself. It is even said in one story that God inspires the false prophets to prophesy falsely by putting a lying spirit in their mouths. Now these are surely jobs which should be assigned to someone else than God. Surely he should have some underling or some flunky to take care of such things. Surely if Satan were around, he would have been used. And one prophet goes so far as to say, or to have God say, I am Yahweh, there is none else. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things. That's Isaiah 45, 5-7. One wonders whether such a job wouldn't be best handled by someone else, an underling or an opponent. But how could God have an opponent? Well, one solution lay close at hand. The Judeans had spent about 2 generations in exile, most of that time under the rule of the Persian Empire. Now in Persia, a man by the name of Zarathustra, or in his Greek version Zoroaster, had propounded a new way of looking at God that was not quite polytheism and not quite monotheism. It was a dualism where the one God has 2 sons, equals and opposites in every way. One son was perfectly good, sought to lead humankind to do the good, named Ahura Mazda. The other son was perfectly bad and sought to lead humankind to do evil. And they're engaged, that's Angkor Mainyu, and they're engaged in this great struggle. Often you see it in this kind of an image that you have here, where this represents the world, and they're having a little tug of war back and forth to see who can control it. Or in the two-faced lion here, going in opposite directions, representing the 2 different divine impulses there. Now, the Jews could never go this far. It does have the advantage of being an intensely ethical religion. That is, it gives you some reason to do good, other than being punished for not doing good. Because if you don't do good, good will not prevail. It's not like monotheism in the Jewish and Christian tradition, where God's going to win no matter what we do. In this case, the good God will only win if good people cooperate with him. And so I think Zoroaster's intention is to create an ethical conception of God, and in that he succeeds wildly. But it'd be too radical for Jews who could never think of their God as having an equal and opposite number. But the existence of such a figure would do much to explain the present state of the world, especially the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. As we saw last week, Antiochus attempted to obliterate Yahwism and establish Greek religion in Israel. Those who refused suffered terribly. Now Daniel explains this suffering by saying it's the end times, but then he says part of the problem is that the prince of Israel, Michael, has to fight with the prince of Persia in order to win the day here. Now, of course, one of the princes of Persia is Angkor Mainyu, the god with the inclination to evil. If life in this world is a contest between good and evil, it's pretty easy to see who's winning out. You can see that someone like Angkor Mainyu would be handy to have around. Someone to blame things on. Sort of like having an older brother who constantly gets into mischief, as I had the good fortune to have. Such a figure would explain why bad things happen and have the distinct advantage of letting God off the hook, or in this case, me off the hook. Now, here the resume of Satan gets a little fuzzy. It seems that rather than setting up shop in his own name, there was, after all, a strong bias against undocumented immigrants. Angkor Mainyu adopted the identities of various local bad guys before he finally settled on the identity of Satan. So, the biography of Satan, how we got from Angkor Mainyu to Satan. It took centuries for this new identity to take root. We can trace some of the steps in other literature from the period, but not all. People began to discover things about evil in the Hebrew scriptures that they had not noticed before, once this figure begins to develop. They seem to confirm and explain this new role for Satan. So the formula would go something like this. A recipe for creating the Satan, you have to start with a need to explain why bad things happen. Mix in a little Zoroastrianism, take a dash of the accuser, mix in fragments of mythologies from other demons and other biblical writings, and what you come out with at the end is something like the concept of Satan or the devil that we know. People began to see these things in Scripture that are not technically there. For example, the snake in the Garden of Eden now begins to be thought of as the devil. Though in the story it's not. There's no mention of a devil or Satan. It's just a snake. Now it's a snake that can talk, to be sure. But that's not so impressive. I mean, God created all the animals to be God's companions in that story. I presume they could all talk, or they wouldn't have been his companions. So kind of a funny story where he goes through all the animals, and Adam keeps saying, that's a giraffe, but no, that's not what we're looking for. That's a gorilla, maybe we're getting closer. Then God finally puts him to sleep and takes out a rib and creates Eve, and he wakes up and says, okay, that's what we've been looking for all along. Why didn't we start there? But in the story, it's just a snake. But once Satan becomes a construct, it's possible to see that snake as something more than just a snake. In the same way, Isaiah's taunt against the king of Babylon speaks about a fallen star, and by this time it's common to identify the stars with angels, just as the Greeks identified them with various gods like Venus and Mars. So this star would set his throne above the throne of God, and so outright rebellion against God is associated with Satan, or should I say with Lucifer, for that's how Jerome translated the morning star in this story, and that's what has been one of the titles of Satan ever since. In a similar way, Ezekiel's denunciation of the king of Tyre is now read to produce another theory of the fall of Satan, namely vanity and narcissism. Notice the key charges against the king of Tyre. Now that Satan has been understood as a construct, these things begin to be thought of as the history, the biography of Satan. Vanity and narcissism. Now, sometime before the 1st century CE, the various named demons, or fallen angels, began to be amalgamated. We've already seen names like Azazel, Semyaza, the prince of Persia. Talbot will call him Asmodeus, destruction. Jubilees will refer to Mastema. The Ascension of Isaiah calls him Samael. The Testament of Solomon uses Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. It seems that Satan is an amalgamated entity. The ancient prosecutor in Yahweh's court, Ha-Satan, is fused with Zoroastrian Angramaynu, who is then developed by borrowings from the mythic fragments and stories of demons. The results were not always agreeable. The different versions of his fall point to different possibilities, different reasons for that. The Dead Sea Scrolls would call him Belial, or Beliar, worthless. By the time of the New Testament and the rabbis, however, Satan is the preferred, though not exclusive name. The Gospels often refer to him as Beelzebub or Beelzebul or some other title like that. We cannot trace the steps in the establishment of this new identity, but we are most fortunate to have a trove of Jewish literature from the period of 150 to 50 when all this is happening, writings uncensored by later Jewish or Christian thought, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll talk more about them next week, but the Dead Sea Scrolls developed in a rigidly divided community, and they saw the threat as both internal and external, and had a strong concept of Satan or Belial or Mastema, as they call him in various writings. They see the world as strongly dualistic terms, the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. And the sons of darkness include all outside their individual community, including their fellow Jews who are deceived by Belial. We'll give the matter more attention next week. But this is unlike Daniel. Daniel has no concept of Satan, but he has no concept of a divided community either. For him, the threat is the prince of Persia, that is, an outside force acting on his community. One prominent early Christian historian, Elaine Pagels, highlights the correlation between religious belief in Satan and the sociology of the community by contrasting Daniel and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Daniel has no concept of Satan nor any concept of a divided community, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls saw and this is her quote, the foreign occupation of Palestine and the accommodation of the majority of Jews to that occupation are evidence of that the forces of evil have taken over the world and, in the form of Satan, Mestema, or the Prince of Darkness, infiltrated and taken over God's own people, turning most of them into allies of the evil one. So the concept of Satan here is of a more internal force which divides the community itself. The arrival of Satan casts the end times in a whole new light. And we talked about various aspects of the end times last week. And the final piece of the puzzle, the one that allows us to make sense of everything else, is the arrival of Satan. Good people suffer because of Satan. With the advent of Satan, the notion of two ages makes more sense. For these two ages are ruled by two different rulers, competing for control of the world. Or to put it another way, Satan is not necessary for the end times model, nor is the end times model necessary for the concept of Satan to develop. But together, they magnify each other and enhance the force of each other and make a coherent system. Now it becomes clear that the battle is not simply against some wicked ruler. It is a cosmic battle between God and Satan, or more likely between Michael and Satan, because God is going to remain above this fray in Jewish thought. Now it becomes more clear that the battle is not simply against some wicked ruler. It is a cosmic battle, as I just said. It remains to consider the impact of this arrival on the society to which it becomes common. So finally, the sociology of Satan. Just as social setting influences religious beliefs, so religious beliefs have social implications. It's what we call a dialectical relationship, or, if you will, a two-way street. At the center of human authority in the ancient world was the local king of the city. But by the time that Satan develops, God, like the emperor, has moved far away. The emperor is in a distant place now, and one only deals with the intermediaries of the emperor. In the same way, God is envisioned as far away, and one must deal with his intermediaries. God is more remote, working through others. Then the arrival of Satan changes things. No longer is God the good creator and maintainer of the world who rewards good and punishes evil. Now there is Satan. No longer is the world seen as essentially good and life meaningful. The world is an evil place, and good individuals are trapped in an evil system under the power of a malevolent force. No longer are things what they appear to be. They may in fact be the opposite of what they appear to be, because truth is now hidden. These developments have had important and long-lasting consequences in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Not only has each maintained some idea of Satan, each has constructed an end times scenario in which the evil one appears incarnate in some human figure, known as the Antichrist, the Armilus, or the Dajjal. We have not seen this figure in any of the works we have examined thus far. Not even the highly developed mythology of the Apocalypse of John has an Antichrist. There is a letter traditionally associated with John, though it is anonymous, that talks about knowing that there was going to be an Antichrist in the world, and claims that even now there are many Antichrists in the world, a somewhat different concept. And finally, there's one late Pauline letter, known as 2 Thessalonians, which talks that the man of sin has to be revealed before the end can come. And that has been elaborated into this notion of an Antichrist. Perhaps the earliest example of investing a historical figure with the traits of Satan is found in the Sibylline oracles, where Nero is labeled as Beliar. These oracles pretend to be the oracles of the Sibyl of Apollo, but probably come from the late 1st century from a Christian author. It seems to be a common experience to identify one's foes as agents of, or now perhaps incarnations of, Satan. Now, if, as I think, there was some finesse, some mystery, some ambiguity and contradiction in the imagination of Satan, There is none of that in the imagination of the human end times representative, the Antichrist. The Antichrist is presented in the crudest sort of imagery. I doubt that even Milton could make him an interesting character. First, a general summary shared by all three traditions. As the end approaches, a seemingly pious leader, but of course end times thinking things are not as they appear, a seemingly pious leader will emerge, attracting a near universal following. But when he has consolidated power, he will reveal his true nature, oppressing and killing those who follow God and insisting on divine honors for himself. He will, in other words, try to fulfill Satan's goal of humanity bowing before him. This leads to conflict and ultimately to the battle of Armageddon, when God will send a Savior who will defeat and kill the Antichrist. The final judgment, including the resurrection of the dead, ensues, and all the foes are vanquished. On this general scenario, all three agree, although they identify the foes and the vanquished in different ways. They agree on the general picture, but as you can guess, the devil is in the details. I've been waiting all hour to say that. Let me briefly emphasize a few of the contemporary views of the Antichrist for each tradition. In Christianity, the Antichrist tradition seems today to be almost exclusively maintained among evangelical Protestants. The dominant form of end times thinking among evangelicals is called dispensationalism, which we'll explore more fully in week 6. But briefly, dispensationalists claim that as the final time period approaches, there will be a 7-year period inaugurated by the rapture of all true believers out of the world, and those left behind will have 3.5 years of relative calm when the Antichrist appears and consolidates his power, and then 3.5 years of absolute hell as he attempts to lay waste to the world and to humanity. Those left behind will suffer greatly. Having gained power, the Antichrist reveals himself with intense tribulation, the technical name for this period. He is especially hostile to Jews, including a desecration of the temple, and thus evangelicals believe the temple is going to have to be rebuilt by then. They also favor the original boundaries, the biblical boundaries for the state of Israel, as necessary to fulfill God's promise to bring Israel back together again. Now, this anti-Jewish hostility will lead eventually to the great battle of Armageddon, when Jesus will return and destroy all earthly opposition, inaugurating a Christian empire that will last 1,000 years. There follows the final judgment, in which all those not found written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. Traditionally, the Antichrist has been said to be a Jew. He is, after all, the mirror image of the Messiah. Jesus was a Jew, so the Antichrist will be a Jew as well. But lately, more and more have been making the case that he will be a Muslim. I found this book with the subtitle like enhanced a little bit to make his point clear, that the Antichrist will be a Muslim. Thus, interestingly, if Obama is the Antichrist, he must be a Muslim. In the Left Behind novels, the dominant manifestation of this form today, the Antichrist turns out to be the Secretary General of the United Nations, clearly a satanic organization. Now, Judaism and the Armalists. Armalists is a term that we're not quite sure of. It may come from a corruption of the name Romulus, thus an image for Rome, or it may come from a Greek word meaning the one who deceives the people. But in any case, the rule of Armalists is directly related to the Jewish notion of two messiahs coming at the end of time. There will be a Messiah, son of Joseph, who will come and begin the battle, but will be killed by the Armalists. And then the Messiah, son of David, will appear and prevail over the Armalists and establish God's rule on earth. There's an elaborate myth about the birth of Armalists from a stone statue of a beautiful young maiden. Presumably Satan has had intercourse with the statue, and it breaks open, and this creature is revealed, who is 18 foot tall and 3 foot wide, described as having eyes that are red, a crooked nose, crooked eyes, red hair, green feet, and 2 skulls. In other words, a monster. Now, the good news here is that very few Jews have even heard of the Armilus, and fewer still take it seriously. Armilus is generally considered to be Roman, though the end time interpreters, I found a few cases where Jewish interpreters would claim that he's Muslim. Begin to see how these stories can be used one against the other. Islam and the Dajjal. Among the various descriptions of the Dajjal, he is said to be short, fat, albino, with a bald forehead, one blind eye, a ruddy complexion, extremely curly hair, perhaps with the word kafir, infidel, tattooed on his forehead. He should, in other words, be easy to spot. He'll work miracles, including healing the sick, raising the dead. Crops will grow, livestock will prosper. He's even said to be capable of stopping the sun's movement. Now, all the details about the Dajjal are drawn from the Hadith. You remember those stories attributed to Muhammad. None of it is found in the Quran itself. He is said to be pious and regarded as a righteous leader. In spite of this description, you'd have to figure this description isn't compatible with somebody appearing to be righteous and just, but traditions are not always consistent with each other. Like the Christian Antichrist, he will gradually reveal himself, and like that story, God will then send Jesus back into the world who will kill the Dajjal. Much of this seems to be a case of interreligious borrowing between Christianity and Islam during the period of the birth of Islam. Some traditions have the Mahdi appearing first and gradually emerging as the opposition leader to the Dajjal, later to be joined by Jesus in the struggle. So according to that view, the Dajjal and the Mahdi could both be in the world now, accumulating their various power bases and preparing for this final battle. Could be, we say. The Dajjal narratives are often dismissed by Muslims in the early 20th century, but have flourished of late. Much contemporary interest associates him with Israel and sees him as Jewish. Some identify him with collective realities rather than an individual person, such as Israel or US or Zionism. Note the flag and the medallion in the cartoon. Clearly this tract is produced by a Muslim who views Israel and the United States as in league with evil. Various traditions posit various origins for the Dajjal, but generally it's in the East and generally he's said to be Jewish, as is the Christian Antichrist, by the way. You remember Jerry Falwell got into trouble for saying the Antichrist was going to be Jewish just a few years ago. Now, some of those who write tracts about the end times are conscious of the Christian anti-Muslim tracts about the Antichrist and write in conscious effort to refute such views. In summary then, we see how and when and why Satan was created and developed, a dynamic relationship with end times thinking, and we have briefly looked at the influence of Satan on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. First as a malevolent spiritual force, and second as part of an end times expectation of an Antichrist. I will close by raising a few questions about these developments. So, what good is Satan? Clearly, Satan must serve some useful purpose or he would not be able to keep his job. I invite your thoughts on the subject. I'll briefly outline some of my own thinking, and then perhaps we can discuss them. First, Satan allows believers to blame someone other than God when things go wrong. This is probably the greatest advantage of Satan, even though it's not entirely rational. For all three systems insist that Satan only operates by divine allowance. So it removes God one step from evil, but I don't think has the force of actually exonerating him. Secondly, Satan provides a ready explanation for suffering and is oddly empowering. It means that what happens is not an accident. One can stand against evil powers, not so much against chance. Thirdly, Satan causes us to see history as a moral issue. Actually, I owe this interpretation also to Elaine Pagels, who wrote that the end time scenarios, quote, have taught even secular-minded people to interpret the history of Western culture as a moral history in which the forces of good contend against the forces of evil in the world. Of course, that is not an unmitigated good. That can also be one of the problems. But of the problems, I suggest three for balance sake. Once we begin to interpret the world in moral terms, compromise becomes difficult. If our enemies are evil and will remain evil, if the age is ruled by Satan, what can we do when the good guys seem to be in charge? One way to ask this is there a room for Constantine in this vision of things? And there seems to be something innately perverse in the notion that any good leader, anyone who seeks peace and tries to bring people together, should be suspected as perhaps being the Antichrist. Related to this is the absolute dualism that Satan represents. It divides the world into us and them, with us being good and them being bad. At least a dangerous proposition, and also a very simple-minded one of black and white. It is further potential of turning what could be a relative conflict into an absolute conflict. This, I think, is one of the elements in finding a satisfactory solution to the problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the Middle East. Finally, the Antichrist, or what one writer calls the American obsession with naming the Antichrist. From King George to President Obama, with everyone from Hitler, Gorbachev, Saddam Hussein, the Pope, labor unions, United Nations, and even the Universal Product Code in between, and there are many more. This seems to me to be a tiresome game, amounting to no more than a convenient way to hang a label around the necks of our enemies. Shouldn't we call a moratorium on such things? Or is it, as Woody Allen suggests, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you? So with that, I invite some conversation. I've said some things that I'm sure offend some people. I don't mind doing that, but so I'm not going to apologize, but I'll be glad to enter into some conversation about it. And someone has a mic for me so I can wander around. So who's going to start us off? I see a hand. Yes.
I just have a question about the opportunities. Besides the Jewish medallion and the American patch, it seemed to me that there was a Soviet. What is the, or is that Muslim? What is that above the flag?
Yes, I think you're right there. I'm just talking. If I keep talking, it's going to get loud. Yes, whoever wrote that tract is clearly not simply anti-American, he's anti-imperial policy.
I have a question about, we see stuff like this, and I'm thinking about some of the garbage that came on email and stuff before the election. How powerful and persuasive are these kinds of images? Do people take them really seriously? Is there just a small group that takes them seriously? Where would they fit on the Google scale of importance?
I can't answer that question, but I can tell you that the Left Behind books have sold over 350 million copies, and that Hal Lindsey, who wrote The Late Great Planet Earth, was able to build a mansion in Malibu on the proceeds from his book. So somebody's buying it. Probably nobody here. We wouldn't now. Next, please. Yes.
Do you see any connection with this propaganda story, these images at Fox News, the position that Fox News takes on religious questions?
I'm glad you phrased it like that. Do I see? Because I don't watch Fox News. I don't see it. I suspect that there are a lot of subterranean influences flowing back and forth between religious, political, and sociological, and that these things are forming something of a package. I'm going to try to deal in week 6 more explicitly with groups within each of these traditions are taking active part in bringing about the end times. So maybe some of this can be addressed at that point. Is that a question? Or just
Just
yes.
You had one slide up there on, and it was headed up original sin.
Yes, I'm trying to recall what was the, what was the reason for the fall of Satan in the developing biography of Satan? And what you find is in different traditions you find different causes. Is it sex? Is it pride? Is it active rebellion? Is it trying to replace God on his throne by having his throne above God's? It's not a consistent tradition. And there's nothing in the Bible, any place, or in the Quran for that matter, that presents a consistent image of Satan, or any history of Satan. This develops in the extra-biblical tradition, and in ways that are no longer plain to us. What we can say for certain is, at the end of the period of the Old Testament, around 400, there is no Satan. By the time we get to the Gospels in, say, the Gospel of Mark in, say, 65 CE, it's a fully developed figure that everyone can simply take for granted. It's a rather dramatic change in the course of 300 years or so. And I think it has to do with the parallel development of this end-time thinking. That the two matched each other so well that each enhanced the viability of the other concept. Sir?
You mentioned chance today. Does that come up ever? Is there a rejection of the idea of chance or an acceptance of chance? Does that ever come into anything that you've been looking at?
No, most of the ancients attribute actions to voluntary personal forces. I'm always charmed by the parable of Jesus that seems to be so bright. He talks about a guy that went out and brought a good seed and planted it in his garden, and he went back to check on it. Weeds come up, and his conclusion is some enemy has done this. I feel that way every spring. This is a chance. They didn't just spring up. Some of my students figure out where I live. So not much room for chance in biblical thought. Jewish Christian dogmas. Faith more like that. Yes.
It would seem from all of your explanations and giving us all this history that people have a primitive need to explain evil in the world. Now, I say primitive because one would assume that the more you read and know, the less you would accept all of this. Do you think that happens, or do people really do believe this with, say, maybe they've had a great deal of knowledge, or they've studied a great deal?
I would like to think that knowledge rescues us from primitive myths, but I don't find that to be the case. Some very well-educated people with strong religious convictions believe in a personal devil. And I don't have any objection to that, as long as you don't want me to do it. But we all need to explain evil in the world. And this is one way in which that has come about. And it does certainly surprise me that you maintain such viability. That 3/4 of the American people haven't been in. Most of you in this room, if you're typical, of course you're not typical, you would be here. That's some notion of Satan. Jerry?
I don't remember the slide it was on, but you mentioned incarnation somewhere.
Yeah,
Do you think there's any relationship between the notion of the incarnation of Satan and the incarnation of Christ?
no.
Repeat the question.
I mentioned, I used the allusion that Christians began to imagine not just Satan, but a human manifestation of Satan, or instead of an incarnation of Satan, in the Antichrist. Now I find the two rather at odds with each other. Satan very intriguing figure, I think. However you put it together from all these various pieces of the puzzle. The Antichrist seems to be just such a one-dimensional character, or two-dimensional, looks good on one day and bad on the next day. And there's no subtlety about that concept whatsoever. So I find that a much less interesting idea, just at the level of ideas. But I didn't have any sources that actually talk about the incarnation of evil, but the attribution of satanic traits to human figures is what was found.
And one other thought, if people want to attribute certain individuals to the, like, Antichrist, for example, and to formulate this in my mind, does that mean that they feel justified in going after that individual as if they could kill Satan, which we haven't been able to, so-called Satan, which we have not been able to do for all these past millennia?
Well, I find it very instructive, this whole business of Obama and the Antichrist. Just how these various things come together. And I think one of the main problems with Obama, from the viewpoint of this end-time thinking, is that he's so darn popular. Everybody loves him. So watch out for such people. And then you have the added notion, his middle name is Hussein, after all. So I think the imagination takes over here for some people in a way that I find just very intriguing. It seems so beyond the realm of possibility to me that I can't take it seriously. That this Gallup poll said 24% of Republicans thought he could be the Antichrist. Shocking figure in my mind.
Because you don't watch Fox News.
Next.
I have a somewhat related question. In terms of free will and Satan, is Satan necessary for free will?
It's necessary that Satan have free will.
No, that
Oh, is he
the
necessary?
idea of free will for humans.
No, I don't think so. I think we can. I find I can tempt myself just as readily.
Then what would be the explanation?
Well, as a famous Princeton theologian once described the doctrine of original sin, at heart, my dear, we're all bastards. I think the human condition is ambiguous enough. I don't want to go to Freud in terms of what Satan has a projection of our own inclination to evil, but some of that I think is involved in these kinds of people who are trying to explain these things before we had things like science have recourse to imagination and storytelling. Is that a question?
Oh yeah, I have a question. I know we talk about in in religion, you even mentioned that when it came to how is God good or how does God let these bad things happen, because we try to get him off the hook, in a sense. Would it be fair to say that God could be a component of God is the devil then necessarily? There has to be a bad part in order for people to seek the good part of God, I guess.
You remind me of a famous statement by Voltaire, who said that God created us in his own image and we have many times returned the favor. I think the notion of that if humans are created in the image of God and we have this inclination to evil that maybe God has, would be a wildly heretical concept for Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Doesn't mean that it's unthinkable, it just means that we wouldn't find a great home. Would be blamed on Satan in any of those traditions. Are you still having fun? Yeah.
I've come here to learn, and I'm impressed by a well-known psychiatrist, and I forget his name, who extremely intelligent, never could believe in a physical manifestation of Satan, but he attended a helping Dr. Speak,
Exorcism?
exorcism. And after attending this exorcism, he went from not believing in the power of a manifestation of a devil to saying, yeah, I've experienced it. I do believe that a person can be taken over by this devil or evil spirit. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Okay.
And I think that what you're pointing to is crucial, that the notion of Satan is as much an experiential concept as it is an intellectual concept. It is an attempt to make sense out of a certain element of human experience, namely the experience of evil. And it's possible that when in a situation like that, there's a common story in Matthew 9, where Jesus heals the boy who has a demon, and then they say he has epilepsy. So that the ancients, it's entirely possible to observe a certain behavior in humans, or in my case, I thought my dog might be possessed for a while. Turned out he just had an ear infection. You can experience things and develop an interpretation of them that might be true, or in this case, true might simply mean useful. Certainly a lot of intelligent people believe in Satan. Certainly they do. I don't have to be one of them.
Intelligent people or
Maybe not one, yeah. We'll leave that for history to judge. I got a hand? Oh, she said.
Back at the time of Jesus, how widespread then was this belief in Satan among the Jews?
Well, unfortunately, George Gallup hasn't been around yet, so we can't say with any certainty. But it seems very widespread among Jews. Fairly pervasive. Both the notion of end-time thinking and the idea of Satan.
As a personification of evil, as a figure?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ancients by and large didn't think in abstract categories, they thought in personal categories. So if they're going to talk about evil, they're going to talk about an evil person, not an evil social force. It's a wonderful book by Walter Wink called The Powers That Be, in which he tries to take the ancient categories of demons and principalities and powers and understand them in sociological terms in the modern world. It's a different way of looking at that kind of phenomenon. One last question?
Dr. Barr, do you think he's wrong?
Who?
Walter Wink.
No.
Good. I think he's right.
No. But I think he has a way of looking at these phenomena in something other than mythological category, which I think is worth trying. Well, you've got a patient audience, and I appreciate your attention.